And we are live. Hello, viewers. It's been a while since I've done a stream on this channel, but if you're paying attention, you will have been listening to me streaming on other channels. Let me just move my mic a little closer here. So, today we're going to do, or tonight, who knows? It's today, tonight, wherever you are in the world. It's morning for Furius Pertinax, who's joining us for another Ukraine update stream. How are you doing, Marcus?
Good, thanks, gents. Hello, Charlie and Mandrill, and hello to the audience. It has been a little while. As you guys know, I was off Twitter for a little bit. Had to take a little hiatus, IRL stuff. But it's good to be back. For anyone who follows Apostolic Majesty knows, we've been sort of back to intermittent streams again, and good to be back, Charlie. Because I know certainly us three and a couple of our friends, we've followed this conflict for some time, and we copped certainly a lot of flack over the last couple of years with our opinions and our perspectives. And I mean, we haven't got everything right, but I think, shall we say, events that have occurred since our 1,000-day stream have definitely come a long way to vindicating what our position originally was. And I think a lot has transformed along the front line and in the Donbass war since then. So, as you say, we have much to cover.
Yes, and of course we've got Raging Mantrol here again. It's a little late for you, so if you don't stick around the whole time, that's cool. I've got an hour advantage on you. How are you doing?
Not too bad. I do have relatively early things to do tomorrow, unfortunately, but I will stay around for as long as I can.
So we'll front load with what you want to stick around for. Shall we start with Trump and Putin, or shall we start with looking at maps and looking at Pokrovsk?
Let's start with the maps, I think.
Yeah, I knew you were going to say that. All right. Let's start with the maps.
Bring forth the map autism.
Do you want Defense Politics Asia or Deep Throat UA?
Oh, Deep State's fucking useless these days.
All right. Well, I like seeing like the greatest extent of cope. Like that's.
Yeah. It's a lagging indicator for sure. Yeah.
All right, let me just close these tabs. I definitely do not want to share because I noticed they came up in my select list. Okay. Just so we don't misclick. You don't want to misclick your tabs. All right, so I'm going to share the DPA map tab. All right, I don't have it full screened, but that's okay. So, yeah, we're actually zoomed in right on Pokrovsk right now. I mean, what is there to talk about? Well, you know what? Let me look at the DPA map just 1 second because it gives us a time lapse view that's nice. So what do I have to do? I have to stop screen and then reshare. Yeah, I'll share the Deep Throat UA map because I like one of the things this map does, which is lets you go into the past. So we streamed 8 months ago, right? So it was February. Why don't we just look at, let's say, February. What did the map look like in February 14th, Valentine's Day? Lovely. So about 8 months ago until now, right? You can see a pretty substantial change there, especially if you look at the Donetsk region around Pokrovsk and especially southern Donetsk. I don't know if you can see my cursor on the screen, but yeah, southern Donetsk, this area, you can see where the Donetsk Oblast ends on this curving line here. I actually forgot I can draw the map. But if we jump to today, yeah, boom. It's basically all taken, right? Like, where's the little drawing tool? Like, the battle for southern Donetsk is over. Like, that's the line, right? Literally have this tiny bit left, basically, that they haven't taken. And then, of course, if we scroll up a little bit, we can see, let's do like this view. We can see what's been happening around Pokrovsk. So again, we'll go all the way to Valentine's Day, and then we will jump back to today. Wow, you can see pretty big change, especially up here by Le Mans as well. I'll do that one more time. I'll just kind of jumping to the northern flank over here, and jump back to Valentine's Day again. Yeah, you can kind of see it spread out fairly evenly across this area. If you look at Kupiansk or by Le Mans, pretty substantial. And then, of course, LMAO. Oh no! Oh no! No! Look what happened here. They were in Russia, and now the Russians are in Ukraine.
First one Uno, 180 Uno reversed. You know.
Yeah,
Couldn't
this one
play
I'm kind
the
of smug.
reverse card, yeah.
This one I'm kind of smug about because I know we caught some shit for this from your usual suspects. I don't think there's a lot of NAFO people around anymore hanging around these places, but yeah, we were right on this as well. I mean, it went nowhere. It's been reversed. Ultimately, it's now backfired on the Ukrainians, and there was a fascinating operation around Sucha that happened with the whole pipeline attack. I'll leave that, I think, for other people to explain. So, all right, Mandrill, what do you want to focus on here in terms of what's been going on? I think probably this area is like the most interesting.
Yeah, yeah. I think over the last 8 months to last year, I mean, really since we saw the fall of Avdiivka, I mean, how far back is that? That's like, I mean,
That was over a year ago.
that's
I was like,
that's. Yeah, I'm just thinking on the map. That's like an incredible. That's like where the red line meets the purple line, basically. So you can just see how much has been gained since Avdiivka, basically. Yeah,
yeah, I mean,
and
Avdiivka's
just
way back here.
since the fall of Avdiivka, the Russians have just made steady progress to the west and to Pokrovsk, pretty much as I predicted initially, after the failed Ukrainian offensive of the summer of 2023. And I mean, what else is there to say other than the Russians have made excellent use of the attacking in oblique order? They have, and it really, really displays the the inability of fortifications to stop an enemy advance. Fortifications do not necessarily stop enemy advances; they simply delay the enemy advance and delay the inevitable. Right? If the enemy
Yeah, I mean,
attack,
just look at all these fortifications that are drawn on the map. That's all the yellow.
right? And I mean, even the right. So now Pokrovsk has basically first it was outflanked on the one side on the south, and now it's double enveloped in classic Russian fashion. This is the preferred Russian tactic once again for taking major urban areas. They did it in Bakhmut, they did it in Avdiivka, and now they're doing it in Pokrovsk. So, and of course, Munich-Grad's in that little pocket as well. And it seems that now they are developing northwards as well, which is a new
Yeah, I mean,
development over the last several days.
honestly, the Ukrainian map isn't even coping that hard right now. But like this area right here that the Russians have double enveloped and are coming close to encircling, like this is like 100 square kilometers of territory. I mean, this is a large urban agglomeration of these two cities, and they were over here on the left here by Udachne for months and months ago. Let's just jump back again, all the way back to let's say like February.
So
Yeah,
just as
like
you
they,
search that, Charlie, I was going to say, yeah, Kotlina and Udashne. Oh, not Udashne, but Kotlina has like changed hands like 3 or 4 times in the last couple of months. Like they've just been sitting there, like you say.
Yes, the Ukrainians have made excellent usage of localized counterattacks in this area, specifically in the vicinity of Kotlina and Shevchenko and all of that area. Shevchenko is very important strategically as well because I didn't know this prior to the war starting, but they do have a lithium mine there, of all things. That is a strategically important resource, and you need the Pokrovsk rail hub to transport that material out for manufacturing and refinement reasons. So
yeah, so really since mid-January they've been over here, which is interesting because this is what we predicted would happen is they would try to encircle Pokrovsk. Like I think originally you seem to think they would probably go straight forward, but after it got to this point and it stayed like this, basically for like a month, it became clear that what the Russians were going to do is they were just going to stop right here and then try to encircle the thing, right? And that's literally what they've done now. Is they've spent months and months and months, more than half the year, taking all of this territory in order to, because you're going to need territory like at least 10 kilometers wide to put your battalions or brigades through. The Russians use like kind of an in-between grouping unless they've changed that. But in any case, you need a certain like depth in order to actually get your men through. and not have them be exposed to, say, artillery would really more mean drone attacks at this point from every single direction, and have your logistics lines protected. And the problem too is, down in this part of the country, there's actually not many roads heading in the direction you want, which is towards Pokrovsk. And of course, the Russians only recently brought this highway here under control. And obviously, you need more than that to assault Pokrovsk if you're going to do it directly. But yeah, I mean, at this point, they've taken Toretsk. They closed in all of this area right here and have pushed the Ukrainians basically all the way to Konstantinivka. They crossed this road. I mean, the line was stuck, right here at this water body for a really long time. And then eventually they attacked like that, right? And then this area just sort of bloomed out, and look what they're doing. They started going north, and then just in the last few days, we saw this crazy advance. This happened like 3 days ago, and this is what everyone's talking about.
As I've called it.
Yeah, the rabbit ears. It's maybe that 40K rabbit that we saw on Twitter is like a, some sort of a sign of what's to come or whatever. I don't know if you guys saw that, but this is really interesting because we have never seen a breakout like this in like 3 years or more.
Right. I think this immediately gets us into the given explanation of why this is happening all of a sudden. And there are two cited factors for this. Number one is the often commented on lack on the Ukrainian side of infantry to man the trenches. Basically, there has been constant attrition over this war. And this is the given narrative from the more Russian or more neutral side of commentary that, Ukraine is just simply running out of manpower. The second reason of why this has happened so suddenly is that the Ukrainians already were suffering manpower shortages this entire time, and the reasons why for the slow pace of Russian advance is largely due to drones and drone countermeasures and all of that. So they're basically saying that there's another element of warfare that is being used to screen all of the other things that the Russians could be doing to the Ukrainians. And so that's the given stated reason, basically.
Yeah, and of course, since we last streamed, I believe the Russians have pioneered these fiber optic drones, which the Ukrainians are now using as well, which are drones with just kilometers of fiber optic line in them. It leaves some battlefields looking like giant spider webs. It's pretty crazy. Like, they'll get tangled on troops on vehicles and stuff. And, the fiber optic lines can't be jammed because they're direct lines that give basically, perfect vision on what's downstream. And because the signal's in the physical wire that's coming out of the drone, there's literally nothing that can be done electronically. It can only be shot down, which, as we know, is very hard to do. So drones have become even more deadly than they were before, because now it's basically on the drone operator to fail. Whereas before, there were all these electronic warfare options. Now, if the drone operator can pilot the drone where it needs to go, then he's going to hit what he's aiming for, just period. Like, unless the opponent is lucky enough to be able to shoot the drone out of the sky with one of those shotguns or something. So that's even more deadly. If you guys remember, a few weeks ago, I predicted something. I predicted the Russians would do this. They would basically cut the highways north of Pokrovsk and come all the way out to like here. And then they would close up this front a little bit and leave this really narrow path open to Pokrovsk, where if this is about 10 kilometers wide, it means both sides of the envelopment would be able to hit anything coming on the highway. I expect that, and this is the analogy I made, if you recall, I'm calling Pokrovsk and Minorad the Stalingrad of the war, because to me it looks like the Russians are aiming for a proper encirclement here, not just a double envelopment and then storm the city. We've seen some infiltrations into the city. This map does not show it, but we've seen some Russian units appear here, literally in the middle of the city. But it seems like they, attacked and then left. It seems like sabotage and reconnaissance, and just the fact that the Russians were able to penetrate basically to the somewhat like the center of the city. I think deep state UA map shows it. Yeah, it does. They're able to penetrate to pretty much where I pointed, like right here. The fact that they could do that as compared to something like Bakhmut, right, shows how flimsy the Ukrainian hold on even its strongest fortifications are right now. And I suspect that in this area, there's at least 10,000 troops, if not 20,000. And if the Russians are able to, pull off an actual encirclement that closes here and lock those troops in, I mean, that's basically, that could be a war-winning maneuver. Because we look at what's happening up here, and the Russians were able to achieve this breakout, and now the Ukrainians, we have no idea what's going on up here. Hunger the Dye Merchant actually pointed out a couple weeks ago as well that this whole area has been pretty quiet in terms of intel. Not a lot of geolocations, not a lot of updates, and that signifies major fighting. And he was right, because look at what's happening up here. We saw a big lurch to the west, and now we see this crazy attack north. We have no idea what's going on up here. I mean, there are geolocations up here of the Russians. This is a 10-kilometer long penetration, and if the Ukrainians can't pincer this, which they're trying to do, and cut it off and put this back in the bottle, that is a serious problem. Because if the Russians are able to take this and hold on to it, they're now behind. There's like a tank ditch here, and there are fortifications over here, but there's not much built up back here. And if the Russians are able to get deep behind the enemy lines and break out again in other directions, that's going to be a serious problem. Not to mention the fact that I think Azov and some other elite units are deployed here. Wherever those units were fighting before, they're not there anymore. The strategy the Russians are using right now is basically maximum pressure on the whole front. And it's clear right now the Ukrainians cannot hold the entire front anymore. There's movement even now in the legendary Seversk area. The Russians are on the verge of actually reaching Seversk itself. So there's simply no part of the front that is contained anymore, except like around Orkiv. The Russians attack and they take wherever they want, basically. And they're taking bigger and bigger chunks. We're looking at 20 to 30 square kilometers a day. Soon we're going to be looking at 40 square kilometers a day, and we're going to reach a critical point where maybe this breakout gets stopped. But this is really interesting right here, this breakout, because that signifies the turning point when the Ukrainians are breaking. They no longer have the manpower to stop the Russians from going into a maneuver warfare phase where they win not just by attrition on the front line, but by actually outflanking, attacking supply lines, and then cutting off forces from their logistics. And that is going to destroy the Ukrainian military if the Russians are able to replicate this maneuver. But Marcus, you haven't said anything in a while. Why don't you take it a little bit from here?
Yeah, it's interesting that you sort of made the Stalingrad analogy regarding Minorad and Pokrovsk, because it's one of those things where you could sort of see, even from early in the war, I mean, the only proper envelopment that we've actually seen is Mariupol, and that was quite early in the war, and that was a bit easier for the Russians because being a seaside city, you have essentially one less flank to surround. You sort of only have generally 2 or 3 vectors to cover rather than the entire sort of 360 perimeter of the place. Although you could say semi-encirclements were done in the battle for Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, and they kind of did it with Bakhmut, although Bakhmut is probably the closest thing that we've seen to a sort of meat grinder encounter battle in this war. The situation regarding Pokrovsk is certainly something a bit different in that, and to sort of to reference what you've just been talking about the last sort of 10 minutes or so, is that as attritional warfare has taken its toll on the Ukrainian armed forces, what they are unable to do, as you've rightly said, is basically hold the greater part of the line in a more or less static sense. This sort of generalized front line is becoming increasingly porous. And I suppose the point that we broadly made, I think, on the 1,000-day stream was that as the Russians probe, and we've obviously seen this with the opening up or the re-emergence of a Kharkiv front, and the Russians having started attacking in the direction of Sumy, is that they're forcing the Ukrainians with ever diminishing resources and manpower to contain new parts of the front and to deploy combat units to prevent these other breakthroughs. Meanwhile, the main encounter part of the front, the main point of confrontation, is definitely in this southern Donetsk region, as we've been talking about just now. And compared to before, where the Russians certainly had more difficulty in achieving, proper encirclements around Bakhmut and around Lysychansk and Severodonetsk, they're having a much easier time, evidently, of performing that double envelopment around Minorad and Pokrovsk. And we can see here, even with these, I'm trying to think of the reference that we're using, there's a terminology for these sort of recon groups that they have like half a dozen riders on motorbikes.
DRG.
Yeah, that's it. DRG. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And and they're sort of followed. They're covered with drones, and if they are able to sort of hold the larger part of their sort of recon push, they then sort of followed with light troops and perhaps like light infantry fighting vehicles to sort of take and hold territory. And this would not have been feasible, say, 18 months, 2 years ago, whereas now there's simply not the resources, there's not the manpower for the Ukrainians to really resist these attacks. And I think also is we're getting an insight insofar as what ends up being the outcome of attritional warfare. What is the net result of it? And it ends up being a case of whereby when you have two sides that are this asymmetrical in terms of their capacity for industrial output, for production, manpower, and even in terms of like the depth of an army reserve and the general size of the military. I mean, again, this is being talked about ad nauseum, but I mean, what Ukraine's armed forces, I think, when the Maidan event happened, was 15,000 large, and obviously it expanded much more from that. And the Ukrainians have sought to, create these new units, even leading up to the war. And at the very start of the war, it expanded its military rapidly. Whereas, Russia had a fairly decent sized standing army to begin with, and had a very large reserve force, which has been able to draw upon. And the Russians have been able to, perform this broad strategy of attrition. Meanwhile, what it's done is bled the Ukrainians white, and I think also we are starting to see the folly of the, the so-called Great Summer Offensive. Was it 23? I can't really remember what year it was, but
2023. It's so long ago now.
Yeah, I know, right? Yeah, like 23. And then when they've even attempted other more minor offensive operations. Well, of course, we had Kursk, in the last sort of 12 months as well, the push into Kursk. And it's been a case of these are, they probably have, you might say, historical comparison with, say, Bulge, the Bella Bulge, Operation Vakamrain, and these sort of attempts to stabilize the line or rather draw Russian attention to another part of the front that isn't A, necessarily part of the objective, and B, with these ever diminishing resources, throwing them into headlong attacks that aren't going to achieve anything. I mean, ultimately, what was the rationale for the taking Sudza and that Kursk offensive? I'm talking about this Kursk offensive, not 1943, was to have a negotiating piece on the chessboard. Well, what's happened 9 months later? That chessboard, that chess piece on the board has vanished and has actually become a new part of the front line that the Russians have exploited on Ukrainian territory. And I would hate to imagine the degree of losses amongst their more elite formations in order to attempt these, dare I say, foolhardy offensive operations, and the amount of donated weaponry and weapon systems and material that's been given to Ukraine to build these new units up, and then only to have that material vanish in a very short space of time. And I think really you see on the map here is potentially the point whereby, and I'll be the first to confess that I was expecting to see sort of large air offensives a lot earlier. I mean, here was me probably talking 2022 that like, 18 months later, they'll probably reach the Dnieper, which obviously has not happened. But I think we're starting to see now that this inertia is taking place, and the Russians are in a position to create much more offensive inertia in whatever direction they choose to, wherever they're committing the larger part of their reserve forces and going on the offensive, or where they will from here on in. Which also lends to the point of the Russians have spent this entire time obviously producing more tanks, and they have been, with their mobilized forces, have been creating these new formations, very few of which have actually taken to the battlefield, which I
Yes.
suppose, Charlie, you might want to tap into as well.
I wanted to jump on the word tanks there because I don't know if you've noticed, but one of the things we're not really seeing anymore is tanks. It's a lot of DRG units you see on footage, which are these motorcycle units. It's troop carriers. It's just infantry. It's been a long time since I've seen a lot of tanks showing up on video, and this is really interesting because the satellite footage over from open source intelligence over Russian tank bases, when we did our stream last time, they were sort of at the point where they already reached the point where there's going to be a diminishing number of older and more decrepit tanks coming in. At this point in the war, they've probably stripped dry basically their entire Soviet tank stockpile. There's still more that can be repaired that are coming in, but that stockpile is now more or less 80 to 90% in service. Now, that's not to say that the Russians are out of tanks, though, because all those tanks have not been destroyed. So what I'm thinking is, what are the Russians saving these tanks for? Are they just not very useful, or are they saving them for something? I'm kind of imagining that the Russians are actually saving those tanks for something, because
I would agree.
And I'll tell you what I think that is. I mean, if you look at what's happening now, how have the Russians achieved this? Look up here, right? The Russians have opened this front in Sumy. They're attacking here as well. They've been attacking here forever. They opened a new part of the Kharkov front. They crossed the Oskol River here. They're partially, I mean, even Kupiansk right now is actually close to encircled. I mean, the Russians, we don't even really know what's going on here. Like, the Russians are claiming they're all the way down here, and they're also pushing here now. So, like, we don't even know what's going on there. But the whole front is just completely lit. You know, the Russians are really close to Liman now, which is obviously key to Slavyansk. They're really close to Seversk. They are pushing. Chasiv Yar's been taken. I mean, that's a major change in the map, right? Here's Bakhmut. Chasiv Yar's finally been taken. But my point is, the Russians are pushing everywhere. And they're not going to stop, right? So here's the thing I see happening. The Russians have reached the Dnipropetrovsk Oblast, and are they just going to stop here? They're probably going to stop at the natural barrier of the river. I forget what this river is called. They're going to stop at the natural barrier.
It's called the
Vovcha, yeah. But strategically, it doesn't really make sense for the Russians to stop pushing on this, like, 50-mile wide frontage, right? Because this is pressure they want to maintain on the Ukrainians, especially if the pressure is low here. Like, there's pressure here right now, and there's some pressure around Holy Poly, which is called Holy Poly. There's some pressure there, which is important. I'm not trying to pronounce that, but the Russians can't just have like a permanent operational pause here and let the Ukrainians take all of the brigades that are defending this area and redeploy them when they're needed. They are going to have to push here. So I am thinking that before pushing into other oblasts, they probably want to really clean up in Donetsk first. What do they actually have left in Donetsk at this point? It's actually not much, right? Like, Donetsk ends here. There is not that much territory left to take in the Donbass that they have claimed. This is it. And look at this maneuver they just made here. I mean, they do that 1-2 more times with the appropriate flanking maneuvers, and they could take all this countryside. In fact, I suspect they may try something like this. I suspect that while the Russians are going to move to the west and probably take this area too, and keep putting the pressure on Pokrovsk, to me, it makes way more sense while all the pressure is on Pokrovsk is just take all this, just keep going through these less defended areas that don't have the same level of fortifications built. Get behind Druzhivka, Kramatorsk, Slavyansk, because you have to do that anyway, right? The Russians have to come through here in order to complete, this attack, probably all the way from Izum. So maybe they're just going to push all the way up here at this point.
To which point, if I may just quickly add, I remember last stream, I think we touched on, what are the L's that the Russians have suffered in this war so far, and the loss certainly of Liman, but Izium is a little bit more isolated from the rest of the front, but the loss of Liman and Izium have been something of an L, because you got to think, if the Russians were still there, certainly in Liman, then being able to sort of close those pincers would be a lot easier for them. See, at this point, they still actually have to take them. They still have to. They have crossed the Oskil right up in the north, but in the south, you can still see that they're east of the Oskil, and their inability to be able to sort of close that pincer immediately, or not immediately, but like in the short term, is obviously a bit of an L for the Russians. And so, just wanted to touch on that point, because obviously the Russians had some very advantageous positions. If I'm not mistaken, Izium was captured like relatively early in 22. I think by like March or April they were there.
Yeah, the Ukrainian spring offensive of 22 recaptured all that area in green. That was
correct. Yeah. So, that's just something to keep in mind. But that being said, this is also sort of demonstrative of the fact that I was going to say, I thought April. There you go. Yeah, and look, they even pushed south of Izium right into Zviatohirsk, so they weren't actually that far away at all. But the point being is that you sort of see where they are presently. Just with the rabbit ears just to the west of Konstantinivka. The Ukrainians now, it's becoming quite evident that they're really struggling to, have any spare soldiers to put up against these big breakthroughs, which, lends itself to the quite logical conclusion that, Russia is probably going to move back to that more mobile type warfare in the foreseeable future. We don't know obviously when exactly, and this obviously lends itself to that part of the discussion whereby what are the Russians doing with all these armored vehicles? How much are they stockpiling? How many new units are they raising?
I didn't answer that question, so let me answer that.
Oh, okay.
What do I think they're actually doing with them? So I accept what they're doing with them is the Russians, not this year. I don't think they can take most of southern or Donetsk this year. Maybe they can start getting west of Kramatorsk, right? They have to take all this still. But I think the Ukrainians are just not going to surrender, right? The Russians are going to take all of Luhansk. They're going to take all of Donetsk. They're going to take the rest of Zaporozhye, which is not that actually, there's not that much of, right? Now that you can see the Russians
Well, it's a city in the hinterland, basically, at this point. Much of the rest is gone.
Yeah, exactly. It's literally just this chunk right here, which the Russians can, they took this massive chunk in the last few months. They can get through this. The Ukrainians aren't going to surrender.
And let's not forget too, I can't remember that city that's just south of Zaporozhye, but they've just crossed that little river. They've just taken, just zoom in a little bit. They've just taken Kamyanske, and they've just crossed that river, which was really the last obstacle. That and Stepove, which was like there's one more obstacle there. There's sort of a line there at Yulakivka and Rishne, Primorsk, which sort of is a last river coming out of that that basin there in the Dnieper. But
is that even
once
full though?
That river, that's what I mean. And once they cross that, that's the last obstacle before Zaporozhye. So then taking Kamyansk is probably them setting up a position in order to do that in the next, 6-12 months, I suppose.
It looks like that river does have water in it, so it's not dried out. But Zaporozhye is like right there, the city, right? It's literally right here. So that'll be difficult to take. But the thing is, the Ukrainians aren't going to surrender. And the problem for the Russians, of course, is always Kherson. I'm sure at some point they're going to have to go for it. But the thing is,
and another Russian L, which we've obviously canvassed before.
Even if they do, even if, let's say they actually cross the Dnieper on Zaporozhye and Kherson and take all of this, take everything they've annexed, the Ukrainians aren't going to stop. They're not going to throw in the towel. They're going to keep going. And that's when the tanks come in. Because by the time we reach this point, we're going to have seen numerous breakthroughs like this happening all over the place. And they're going to get bigger. And the Russians are going to be taking bigger and bigger chunks. And that'll be the point when it's time for maybe an armored push up these highways towards Dnipro, when the Ukrainians simply can't resist these sort of pushes anymore because the holes in the front are just getting that big, right? And
there's no reserve to plug the gaps.
Maybe the Russians are saving their armor for these big war-ending pushes that could basically take the entire east bank of the Dnieper, which seems insane, right? But you have to imagine another perhaps a year from now when this kind of breakthrough we're seeing is happening on a regular basis, and eventually, the thing is, if you can achieve a breakthrough deep enough, you can get so far behind the enemy logistics and defenses that you can basically just operate freely, and then go wherever you want. And once the Russians get into a place, the Ukrainians can't remove them. So maybe that is what they're saving their tanks for. Maybe.
I would agree with that assessment, mostly because you can make comparisons to World War I, which is if your enemy has committed themselves to a defensive and fortification strategy, then you're not going to be able to use mobile warfare elements. You're going to have to take what the defense allows you to have and make very, very slow progress until you actually make a breakthrough, at which point then is when you send the maneuver warfare element forward to actually, rout the enemy and deal all the major damage.
Exactly. And this is not a breakthrough. Like we're like calling this a breakthrough, but it's really only in relative terms, because to see like a 10-kilometer advance in one day at this point in the war is like freaking crazy, right? But this is not a breakthrough. If this kept going for days, then it would have been. Or if it was like a 10-kilometer wide breakthrough, like this, that would be a breakthrough. Eventually we will see that, and that's when you pour the tanks in and deal the finishing blow. But that is just a theory. I think it's sound, though, because like you said, it doesn't make sense to use your mobile assets when the war is not mobile. It's just wasting them. And the Russians have figured out these small infantry tactics with DRGs, especially now that one of the keys since our last stream is the Russians now have drone superiority. The last thing that the Ukrainians had the advantage in, they no longer do, mainly because of the fiber optic drones, but also what is that? I forget the name of the drone, the bigger one that the Russians use, but their factories are now producing
not
these
the Shahed?
things. Yeah, the Shahed and the Garan.
Yeah.
Their factories are now
the Shahed
producing
was
these.
licensed production from Iran, and they've been churning them out at like an alarming rate.
Yeah, and the Russian. I was watching some videos of Russian domestic factories, right? And their factories are now geared up and producing these things en masse, as like you would produce artillery shells, right? Because that's what they are. So that has tipped the tides, and now that advantage is swept out from under the Ukrainians, they literally have nothing left. I mean, and the Ukrainians have fought very well. I mean, they have fought far longer and tougher than any of us, I think, thought they would. You could certainly criticize some of their leadership elements, but as far as the actual Ukrainian army itself, I mean, they're definitely some of the crack. They're like the crack military of the world right now. Aside from the Russians, obviously, are on the battlefield as well. We can't really criticize their performance, though. I mean,
the Ukrainians have shown an enormous tenacity and courage, especially under shall we say, like duress of asymmetric military capability, is that they haven't turned and run. They've actually fought literally for every inch of ground, which has been to their detriment in many ways. But I think they've demonstrated a great and for a nation really that obviously Ukraine has a quote unquote military tradition under Imperial Russian and Soviet auspices, but as an independent country, Ukraine itself wasn't an established military power of any kind, and for them to fight as they have is actually very much a how can I put this, a vindication of Ukrainian fighting spirit. It's just a tragedy in that so far it's been you know it's been absconded by you know, interest groups in America and Britain and elsewhere. You know,
I think this is an interesting point too, which is the Ukrainian high command's unwillingness to give up any sort of ground. This is a very fascinating dynamic, and I think I covered this on the 1,000 Days stream, where you have this weird, like, this weird unwillingness to do exfiltration when you've been outmaneuvered, and just fighting to the last man, basically.
Well, that's why Pokrovsk could be war ending, because what's the one thing we know? No matter how bad the situation gets, the Russians take all of this, right?
The Ukrainians will never pull out. Yeah,
the Ukrainians will never leave. They will never leave. So when your opponent is running an AI like that, you just make a ridiculous salient. And
yeah, I will just say, I mean, in the end, not to nitpick, I'm sorry, Charlie, but not to say they'll never leave, because in the end, they did eventually exfil from Lysychansk, Severodonetsk, and they sort of eventually gave up in Bakhmut. But what they'll do is they'll fight to the absolute last. And then what they'll do is, as you say, they'll leave, the Russians will probably leave that last highway sort of untaken. And then when they eventually pull out, all the Russians will drone them and shell them to smithereens, and they'll probably cause as many casualties, or they'll cause a great deal of casualties as they retreat, never mind the casualties they'll suffer in the encounter battle. And moreover too,
this is where they want them to go to.
Exactly, which is, I mean, for those who are familiar with history, that's an old Mongol tactic of, you leave enough of a gap open so that the enemy retreats, and then you sort of, that's where you attack, and that's where you in the Mongol case, it's where you shoot your arrows and draw swords. And in this case,
it's also a fascinating tactic too, because what the Russians could do, given the knowledge of Ukrainian behavior, and this is not just in Pokrovsk. I mean, if they continue with the rabbit ears northward, I mean, you could easily get the rest of remaining portion of the SDD line, or the former SDD line, in a similar way. And if you know that the Ukrainians will never leave, well, you just basically pin them in place. And after you take Pokrovsk, well, maybe once you've pinned the entire Ukrainian army in place in these front cities, basically, and committed them to this battle, that's when you use the maneuver warfare element.
Yeah,
and that's when you unleash that.
We also have this situation building because they've been pushing towards Konstantinivka as well. We have a sort of dual crisis emerging here, where Pokrovsk and Minarad, and then just to the east, Konstantinivka, can potentially be encircled as well. I mean, one of the craziest situations is how the Ukrainians are still holding on in here. Like this pocket down here, which has been slowly closing up for weeks, the Ukrainians will just not let this go. And this is basically just a suicide pocket. I mean, if you're in here, you die. There's like a tiny gap that leads in or out of this part of the front, and the Ukrainians simply leave their people in here. It's insane that they have not pulled out. And now that Chasiv Yar has been taken, and the Russians are actually continuing to push in this direction, they get to Stinky, and that's one end. I mean, Konstantinivka is not even that big, and then they push up a little more here to the north, and now you basically have another double envelopment around Konstantinivka. Or, like kind of you suggested, if they go bigger, if the Russians can actually infiltrate all the way back here in the coming months, that's going to put extreme stress on the logistics for this entire region, because the only way to get in is going to be this, basically just this one highway. That's going to be it.
Which the Russians are also threatening from the north as well. If they can get any success up there at the same time, this whole area is basically over. It's done.
Also that highway too. You got to think. Just look at where like the word Slavyansk is on this map. That highway is hemmed in by 2 rivers. So if the Russians actually do place further pressure there as well, it's a case of if they start really hovering over that area with surveillance and drones and even shelling with conventional artillery, well then that becomes just another kill zone, more or less, both logistically and in terms of manpower. So there's always that risk. The other thing I just wanted to mention briefly is that just if you can just scroll back down, Charlie, ever so slightly, so that we can see both emerging pockets and just come out a little bit, is that what the genius sort of element is here from an operational and strategic standpoint is that by this sort of punch through the middle here, which started forming even a couple of months ago and has really started to materialize with these bunny ears in the last week or so, is that with ever diminishing resources now, Ukraine is faced with the prospect of not a single Mariupol situation, a single Severodonetsk, Lysychansk situation, or a single Bakhmut situation. This is the major part of their remaining defensive line in the sort of central, more northern part of Donetsk Oblast. And both Pokrovsk and sort of Konstantinivka, and then by extension the Kramatorsk, Slavyansk salient, they have to basically defend these 2 emerging cauldrons with less resources than they've ever had at any point in the war. And which one do they prioritize? Which one do they support? Where do they prioritize their logistics and their reinforcements? They actually haven't really been in a scenario this dire probably since the very beginning of the war, where the Russians were themselves pressuring Kiev at the very start. And so that's an important thing to consider, because each of these other encounter battles and cauldron situations have been almost singular affairs. This is happening, 2 events at the same time. And I think that's actually kind of worth taking note of as well.
Yeah, they're going for 2 cities at once. I wanted to bring up the DPA view here because we can see highways. Look how close the Russians are to this highway right here, right? And leading to Kramatorsk. There are not that many highways in this area. This was something that was interesting too. It's like past Pokrovsk, there's not really much up here. There's only small villages and only a few major roads. There's a couple that lead north to south. There are not that many that lead east to west, and the Russians are very close to another one right now. So we have to imagine if this highway is cut within the coming weeks, then the logistics leading all the way to Seversk and also Konstantinivka. How are you going to get things to Konstantinivka now? They're going to have to go through, pretty much just this highway. There's not many ways through this part. I mean, obviously there's small back roads and stuff through these fields, but as far as real logistics tracks you can use, there's the one we looked at going from Izum, which, as we said, has rivers on both sides of it. And then, what else? We can see there's a small road here. It looks like it actually leads back down to this highway. So, yeah, I mean, there's not a whole lot of roads leading in the directions the Ukrainians need here. So it would be absolutely devastating if, like, here's Okrotine again. That's funny. If the Russians were able to get to, let's say, Okrotine, if they go in this northern direction, as I suggested, instead of actually trying to, to me, Pokrovsk just looks like a nice big bait to keep the Ukrainians fixed. The Ukrainians are going to stay fixed in Pokrovsk. They're going to stay fixed in Konstantinivka. Meanwhile, you move through the countryside and take their logistics lines, and then what happens? Like, imagine the disaster if the Russians can actually just get back here to Okrotine. They don't even have to get within, 10 miles of Kramatorsk. They can just cut this logistic line way back here. And now what? It's looking really bad. It's looking really bad.
Absolutely. And there seems to be sort of no way out, certainly from... See, this is one of the biggest gripes. I'm sure you guys probably agree on this because we are obviously like-minded, but this is one of the gripes that I had quite early in the conflict with the way that this was, the coverage was that, the whole, that scene from Napoleon that we always see in the memes, like, we're winning as he walks through the forest,
Yeah.
but there's been such that has obviously diminished, particularly in this last 12 months. But like, this is how Ukraine will win. The Russians are done, like the economy's cooked, like they're militarily spent, yada yada yada. And it just didn't take a genius to actually work out that something as has panned out now was very easily, able to be envisaged if you just didn't, inhale the copium. But so many people got caught up in the propaganda, the relentless media coverage, because let's face it, this is a and I mean, obviously leading up to this stream, I've been watching a bit of Douglas McGregor just to sort of catch up on things a bit. And I mean, he stresses that this is as much like an MI6 sort of operation as it is a State Department one. And really, it's just it's basically that. Like, it's a bit of a it's an op essentially from the West, more or less, like this whole Ukraine shenanigans. And of course, with that comes the machine of the state. It's the propaganda. It's this. Even to the point where, I mean, Charlie, I know you and I laugh about this, but like to the point where they've had kings and generals doing their shilling for them, like in many ways.
Oh yeah.
And
I just watched Kangs in General yesterday.
Yeah, same. I watched it as well, like just to catch up on things. And it's amazing how the tone has changed. Like 18 months ago, they're going to retake Tokmak, and oh, this is what happens if they get back to the Azov, and sort of now it's a case of, oh well, like the front's crumbling and there's nothing we can do about it. And I mean, it seemed pretty obvious from the onset that, I mean, warfare is never a settled thing. Bismarck will tell you as much, but ultimately, a person has to be realistic about these things. And I think really what we're seeing is sort of the vindication of those who understand Russia and understand the Russian psyche and the Russian way of warfare. And I kind of don't. I mean, I know about this via my study of the Eastern Front and, you might say the German perspective. But it's obvious to anyone with a half intellectually honest mindset that the Soviets were successful in the Eastern Front for a number of reasons. And the Russians have carried on large aspects of that military tradition into the present day.
Looking at this little breakout more and more, it's revealing how bad this is if the Ukrainians do not actually squash this. Because if we just look at the roads just to the east, Sofivka is going to be cut off if the Russians are able to hold this breakout, which leads directly to Konstantinivka. Looking at these roads, it'd be quite easy to, because obviously the Ukrainians can't supply through here anymore. The only way to get supplies to Konstantinivka now is to go through Druzivka and through one of these roads leading from the west. I guess some of these smaller roads back here. So we're looking at a pretty extreme supply bottleneck if this is not dealt with, right? Because this entire front is supplied by what's coming into Konstantinivka, and what's coming into Konstantinivka and everything between Chasiv Yar and there is going to have to come in through Druzhkivka now, if this is retained.
Exactly, and just as a point,
that's one road. It's literally one,
solitary
maybe like two
highway. Yeah. Well, one major highway and then like a couple of minor roads next to it. Just go back to the bunny ears for a sec, if you can, Charlie. The other thing is it makes you sort of wonder that, look at all these towns sort of surrounding the bunny ears here. Just go one click closer, just so I can read the city names. Yeah, so, places like Turetske, Vilna, Rubizhne, Shakove, it makes you realize that if the Russians are able to perform this kind of, dare I say, like semi-reconnaissancing force, and they have to scrape together regiments and battalions from elsewhere and thrust them into the battle, then these towns are hardly garrisoned. Like, the Russians have punched, these bunnies are how deep in length?
10 kilometers.
About 10 kilometers. So 10 kilometers, and the Russians have hardly encountered resistance. And sort of, again, it begs the question, is like, there is just no defense in depth. They don't have, even like territorial battalions, they don't have units nearby to be able to plug these gaps, which really goes to show you the extent to which they're overstretched. And that is not a problem that will be resolved or fixed. When you think that when we were talking on the 1,000-day stream, they had got to their 7th or 8th round of conscription. Ukraine is even in a more dire situation now. This is not a problem that will be resolved. And the Ukrainian high command has shown a complete reluctance to perform any kind of, never mind operational withdrawal, but like an actual strategic withdrawal and actually shorten the line writ large, which doesn't bode well for their fighting men. You know, it's going to lead to one tragic outcome for them.
Yeah, the problem is, I mean, there's optimizations you could make along this line. I mean, look how curved it is. You could probably shorten the front by half if you gave up the correct grounds, but even
Yeah,
then,
exactly.
I mean, how would you shorten this front? I mean, Ukraine is so huge. You know, it is just huge. I don't even
Well, that was
know.
always the issue from the onset of the war, and it lends itself also to understanding the Russian initial Russian opening moves. Is that even with a small armed force, if you attack on multiple axes at once, then where do they mass? That's how, in part, how the Russians actually got to Kiev to begin with, and it seized places like Izium and, you know, surrounded Chernigov and basically took Sumy almost, you know, by surprise. Was that they did that, you know, for its landmass, and even though Ukraine is a relatively large country with a pretty sizable population, it's just vast. It's a
And it's
very
all the
large
same.
country for its population, you know.
I mean, these terrain elements, especially the larger forests, matter at more zoomed in operational levels. But
Mm.
as a whole, there's not a whole lot of cannibalizing terrain here. Like, it's literally all just the same thing. It's
Yeah.
pretty flat, pretty uniform in how its roads and railroads are developed. It's so uniform. There's no, I mean, that's the whole point of the war, right? There's no place in this whole area
Mm.
where it makes sense to defend, except
Well,
for the Dnieper.
to the defense of the Ukrainians, ever so briefly, they did make Russian bridgeheads over the Severodonetsk River hard to cross. They did push the Russians back a number of times, but yeah, I mean they haven't really tactically utilized, you know, larger rivers such as the Oskil. What was the Vovchansky River? They haven't used these natural defensive barriers really to their benefit at all. And say, for example, I see where you've got the map now, just south of, you know, Kupiansk. They've got two minor battle groups that are marooned. Well, certainly the northern one is marooned.
Yeah,
The southern one almost marooned, where they're actually on the wrong side of a river with no connecting land bridge. I mean, it is suicidal when you're fighting at a material, firepower, and manpower disadvantage. And just
yeah.
that's
This
not being
this
spoken
front is
about.
pretty incredible. I cannot believe that this has just been left here for this long. You know, all of these troops have been in here for like a year now. The supply must be absolute hell. It's easier to cross the river up here. Down here where the Oskil's wider. I mean, what the hell are these troops doing? It's like
Yeah.
this entire region can only be supplied from the south. You
Yeah.
know, these troops up here have to get their supplies unless they can ferret them across the river in
Yeah.
small boats or something at night. Maybe they can do
Yeah.
that.
I think there's a
Yeah.
handful of bridges. There's a handful of bridges on the Oskil. Like I just saw one further to the south here, but yeah, the point remains is there's just there's one.
If it's even up, I mean,
If
who
it's
even
even
knows?
yeah,
I
Yeah,
doubt it.
and then it's
the
one of those
point
things like, oh
remains.
yeah, they'll throw up pontoons, but I mean, you know, especially in a, and we've obviously all had to learn about this. I mean, when I say us, not just us, but like even, you know, military people and historians and, you know, commentators and whatever, is that this is really the first conventional style war in which we've seen drones become a factor. And I mean, you know, gone are the days where you could probably, you know, erect a pontoon in the dark and then until aerial reconnaissance saw it or some kind of satellite imaging, and then you'd sort of target it with artillery. I mean, now we sort of live in this era where a pontoon goes up and drones can hit that thing within an hour, maybe less.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's not to say the pontoons haven't been used. I mean, especially the Russians have used a lot of pontoons. I mean, they were doing that to support the Kherson bridgehead when they were hitting the Antonovsky Bridge. But, you know, again, the Russians were doing that from a standpoint where I'll just read a comment here, where I think in the early phase of the war, the Russians were firing 20,000 rounds of artillery a day. I mean, at least you can cover a pontoon or a series of pontoons with firepower supremacy, but Ukraine is most certainly not in that position now. And that's sort of the takeaway point, isn't it? You know?
Yeah, note that they aren't shelling Pokrovsk like they've done Ugledar or Avdiivka or Bakhmut as well, which signals to me Russia's looking to take these cities intact because
Hmm.
obviously they have to rebuild all of this shit.
Yeah,
You know, it's like
absolutely.
everything they
And it's just
literally every single thing they blow up, they're gonna have to pay for. Right?
Yeah,
That's a side of this that's not often talked about. It's like, so it's not really in their interest to storm this city and annihilate everything, which is exactly what's going to happen if. And obviously, Mandrel mentioned the lithium mine by Shevchenko earlier as well. There's this is a very rich part of the country. It's not really the only
mm,
one, and
mm,
the Russians. It's not in their interest to just obliterate everything. Uh,
exactly.
All right, we've been going for an hour. Why don't we switch gears and talk about Trump and Putin a bit? So they met today in Alaska, right? The president of the Russian Federation flew all the way, like halfway across the planet. We could actually show it here on the map, can't we? I mean, it is a long way to travel to go from Moscow all the way to Alaska. And they met very briefly, which was weird. Trump sort of mogged him a little bit by having an air show fly over his head as he, got off the plane. And they had a really short meeting, and then the luncheon after between the state diplomats was canceled, and then everyone went home. So that was kind of weird. I suspect that whatever deals were made were pretty much worked out beforehand. I mean, we know Witkoff was going to Russia numerous times. So yeah, they've been negotiating in person already in Moscow for months. I suspect the meeting was basically just a diplomatic cover to formalize whatever agreements they had come to in the background. Alternative
A
explanation
PR
is
exercise of sorts.
basically PR exercise.
Mm.
Alternative is that the Americans are idiots and the Russians came in with their usual asks and the United States hadn't budged at all. But to me, it does not make sense to invite Putin all the way to Alaska and throw this big media and PR stunt unless something had been decided. They did say there wasn't going to be like a ceasefire. They're still working towards it, but it looks good, whatever that means. I actually found the most optimistic thing was the fact that Putin spoke 2 lines of English to Trump as he was leaving. He said, he kind of half jokingly said that you should come to Moscow next time, and then he made some other little remark. And Putin basically never speaks English, so I sort of took that as a sign of a sort of friendly rapport. Otherwise, I don't think he would have done that. This is all very staged as well, so we don't really know what the hell's going on. We could just sort of try and interpret, but I mean, there's almost no way that whatever was agreed to wasn't basically already ironed out beforehand.
It's certainly a positive sign that it was so friendly. In addition to the remarks that Charlie just mentioned, there was a little quip apparently that Putin said when he got off the plane to Trump. I believe it might have been in English, and he said something about oh, we're basically neighbors, right? So this is the spirit in which Putin is negotiating, right? Not as a rival, not as a hostile combatant, but as a neighbor and possible, cooperator when it's in our interest to do so. That's a very, very positive sign. This is, in terms of broader geostrategic terms, extremely, at least if there's a deal, this will be extremely fulfilling for the general Trump strategy vis-a-vis China, right? What Trump and the United States should be doing to contain China is a reverse Kissinger strategy. And in order to implement that, you're going to have to allow Russia some leeway in Ukraine, basically. You're going to have to get Russia, if not on side with us against China, you're going to have to keep them out in the eventuality or possibility of any conflict with China over Taiwan. So just in terms of like big worldwide things, this is actually a very small detail that is extremely positive.
I also noticed Trump made some sort of statement along the lines of Europeans don't mess this up, which was pretty interesting. It does appear, I mean, it's pretty clear that the Trump administration's been trying to pivot to Asia for a long time and cannot. And obviously, the Ukraine war is really sandbagging that. So I think you're pretty much on the money there. And he very clearly sent the signal that they're trying to figure out how to get this thing to wind down, and the Europeans need to stop instigating it. I kind of suspect that what the Russians have been told is, we cannot give you the 4 oblasts. You're just going to have to take them. And when you take them, then we can come to some sort of arrangement of recognition. Because the thing is, like, the media keeps saying, like, okay, Putin doesn't want a ceasefire. The differing perspectives on the ceasefire is Ukraine and the pro-war West wants just a ceasefire where the lines are. The Russians will only accept any sort of ceasefire as the precursor to a full-on peace agreement that will give them what they want, right? The Russians are never going to accept the lines, just ceasefire and then leave it at that, which is what the West is pushing for. I suspect that what the Russians basically have been told is like, look, we can't just give you this territory. You're going to have to take it, but finish up the war, take it, and then we can come to some sort of agreement. The Ukrainians had better hope that is the case,
basically, because once the oblasts are taken, then it's sort of it's a de facto reality, you know.
Exactly. Now, if the Ukrainians still insist on fighting, though, then it's going to get really nasty because, like I said, this part of the front here on the Dnipropetrovsk Oblast, which extends, like this way, like this is, the Russians cannot really afford to just sort of sit on this and not pressure this front. So what's going to happen, and the Russians have threatened this as well, if the Russians clean up in Donetsk, I'll draw it again. If the Russians clean up in Donetsk and they clean up in Zaporozhye, they're just going to keep going because that's the only thing to do, right? If the Ukrainians will not settle, there's nothing else to do but to just keep going. And then they are not simply going to settle for the 4 oblasts. They're going to take whatever else they take. Now, maybe they'll try and just cross the Dnieper. I suspect they're just going to keep taking because, as we discussed, by the time the Russians have actually taken the rest of Donetsk, the Ukrainian army is going to be in such a state that we're going to be able to see these, massive maneuvers like up in the north again, just happen, and they're gonna be crawling across the entire Ukrainian countryside, and then they're gonna take that too. I mean, so the Ukrainians had better be ready to actually negotiate an end once Donetsk here is taken, because if they don't, that's what's gonna happen. Do you guys see any alternative? Because I don't like.
No, that there is no alternative for the Ukrainians. They need to come to a peace settlement, and the way that they come to a peace settlement is how historically you come to a peace settlement. You offer concessions in geography in exchange for a peace.
Yeah, at this point, they still have the Dnieper, and they still have this chunk of Kherson with Kherson City, and they still have the city of Zaporozhye. They can still offer that and just give up the 4 oblasts. That's going to be but it's not going to be on the table for much more than a year, if that. I mean, because once the Russians actually physically control that territory, there's no more negotiating cards, and then the war is going to get real nasty. So, I mean, of course it is already, obviously, but then it's going to get nasty in the sense that Ukraine is just going to be ripped to shreds. I mean, right now it's lost a lot, but it still has Odessa. To the extent that Ukraine's a functional country, it will remain mostly intact. But the time that Ukraine has left to come out of this war mostly intact is going to draw to a close in 2026. I think we can probably agree on that.
Yeah, I would say so. And the other,
And that's the
other
real
thing,
question. Are
yeah.
they going to negotiate? Trump cannot make them stop. That's the thing.
Mm.
Yes.
Well,
Well,
this is
here's
the
the
thing.
thing.
Yeah.
Oh, go
Oh,
ahead,
sorry.
Fury.
No, you go, Mandrill.
Right. I was going to say, in terms of Ukraine might have the will to fight, but do they have the ability to fight? And this is where the logistics battle comes into play. Um, so, right, we saw previously that the Trump admin has no problem in stopping aid, even if it's temporary. Um, well, guess what? The Germans are, and then the rest of the Nordic countries are continuing to provide aid. I think Germany just recently is offering $500 million, and there's a new NATO supply mechanism, which it basically, I think it's called. Let me get the official terminology here. Yes, it is the PURL, or the Prioritized Ukraine Requirements List. This is like a wish list from the Ukrainian side, basically. And unfortunately for the Europeans, right, they're not the ones who are actually providing the military aid through their own manufacturing capability. Most of that is coming from the United States. It's a European slush fund that's being used to buy American manufactured arms and then sent over to Ukraine, which I'm sure Trump would probably have no problem with, just because it's helping him achieve one of his other secondary domestic goals. But the the question is, can Ukraine sustain its losses on the battlefield in the future, and can they maintain their force generation such to meet the requirements of the war, if not exceed them? And the answer is clearly no. There are other major weapons that have been given. I think Australia this year gave 49 M1A1 Abrams tanks. So, of course, the attempts to bring Ukraine back
Abrams and
up to strength.
Bushmasters. Sorry.
Yes,
Okay.
Abrams and
Yeah.
Bushmasters, yes.
Yeah.
The attempts to bring Ukraine back up to something resembling its strength in 2022, 2023 has not stopped. And the other nations of the world, especially Europe, are I guess, the one aspect of a problem for Trump in terms of the peace process.
I dare say as well, just sort of on that note, because you sort of touched on about the equipment big sense for Ukraine, is another fundamental that we're seeing, and this is something I stressed obviously in the 1,000-day stream, and I was sort of stressing it before, is that, and this is where I take a strong degree of umbrage with, like the copium merchants for the Ukraine, the pro-Ukraine sort of standpoint, is that ultimately you're, and I know I tend to use World War II a lot, as a reference point, but it's this whole idea of, you can have an army that is, lavishly equipped with, or, a certain group of formations or whatever that are sort of lavishly equipped. But I mean, ultimately, it's the equivalent of, yes, you can have the Jagdtiger, but if it's being manned by, the youth soldiers, it's not going to be a very effective weapon system, no matter how formidable the said piece of equipment is. And I'm not saying that necessarily Ukraine is at that point yet, but I mean, there's been several reports we've been hearing it over the last year, 18 months, is that the average age of I think a frontline soldier is what, like 37 or 39 or something. Like they're sort of almost getting to sort of Volksturm territory of finding any man over the age of 30 and putting him in a uniform. And then also too with the more recent conscript raisings of conscripts in the country, is that they've been going after sort of 20-year-olds, 19-year-olds who are sort of the future of the country. And I mean, is it worth Ukraine bleeding them on the battlefield for a forlorn cause at this point?
Yeah, that's the other big political question as well, isn't it?
Yeah.
Does Ukraine have the will to mortgage its future? And we haven't seen that yet.
And also too, this is the point that again, sorry to keep citing McGregor, but he sort of made the point too, is that, I mean, and others have said this, but just he's the most prominent person who has at least said it, is that is Ukraine actually going to be a functional state in the future? I mean, ultimately, how can it do it in a complete demographic hole? if it doesn't have enough men to operate as a country, like to the point where, and I don't mean this as line go up, but I mean an economy needs labor, it needs men, it needs people to work its factories and operate its farms and all this sort of stuff, and it's looking increasingly the case that Ukraine is going to literally lose all its men in an unsuccessful conflict with Russia. And that's an immense tragedy for the Ukrainian people.
Yeah, the country is definitely going to be in dire straits no matter what happens. And there's, if the Russians do continue all the way to the Dnieper as the close of the war, and half of the entire country is cut off, how is that population going to really survive at all? I mean, losing all of that economic space in addition to the men and an entire young generation, it's going to be extremely difficult. I mean, the Ukrainian population is just going to become this tiny minority of a people who once existed, basically, if it gets to that.
Yeah, 100%.
Just looking at this map, too, if the Russians... think about how much additional frontage could be generated if the Russians expand out from these avid years, right? Like, nothing. If nothing else changes, look at this is like at least another 50 kilometers of frontage the Russians could generate just by expanding this salient. Like we could very well see something like that. I think it would make a lot of sense right now for the Russians to keep expanding up here rather than to go for Pokrovsk directly. I mean, the interesting thing about where we are right now is we could basically see the end of the war in sight in terms of Donetsk, right? Because they've taken southern Donetsk. It's over. We're looking at the last of it right here, and we can literally see. There's the border. There's not that much more movement left to actually gobble up the rest of this territory, and it hasn't really been until the last few days, really, that we could actually sort of see some of the paths the Russians might take to actually finally capture Donetsk. But yeah, who knows what the real casualty numbers are? Obviously, when these territories were all lost in the first place very early on, the entire populations of these regions were taken by the Russians, so that's a huge chunk of their population right there. A large, part of the population fled to the west, and a lot of them have now died. Millions, maybe. Who can say? I mean, the numbers at this point are just, it could be anything on both sides. I would easily accept a million for both sides.
Well, this is going to be one of the, I mean, I don't use the word interesting, to be tried at all, but this will be the interesting thing that, in the months and years, from now and even after the war is done, is actually being able to quantify and really get a grasp of just how devastating this conflict has been for Ukraine. And one of the things that was stark when I was watching, I watched it, because the two streams I watched was McGregor's interview with Glenn Deason, and then the other interview he did with Mario Norfal, who's that Twitter space guy who does a host, which is actually kind of funny because Norfal tried to frame his perspective on the war about it's both sides are suffering casualties and there's a bit of a stalemate, and McGregor just shook his head, scowled at him and basically says just shut up, Mario, you're lying to your audience, it's bullshit. It's the funniest retort if you've not seen it, and he just has this utter look of dismay on his face. What
was that channel called? I might look it up because I remember
Mario Norfal. He's at YouTube, that's Spaces Guy on X. He just has his own YouTube channel. And anyway, in that interview, that stream, he was basically sort of alluded to the fact that Ukraine at this point has suffered something in the order of over 1.5 million casualties, killed, wounded, civilians, the whole shebang. And I mean, we're not hearing anything like that in Western media. It's a case of, the Russians are on the brink of collapse and Russia will never demographically recover. And I mean, no doubt, the Russians probably have suffered, particularly obviously earlier in the war, with that sort of, Leroy Jenkins sort of blitzkrieg for for Kiev and those initial objectives, and then also in the initial part of the attrition battle, where Ukraine actually was fighting with a strong degree of competency, if not strategically, then at least tactically. Whereas now it's just sort of becoming increasingly more of a turkey shoot. And I wonder if McGregor's actually not too far from the truth of saying something in the order of 1.5 plus casualties, because that's, if true, I mean, we're talking World War levels of loss, something that, almost no one in living memory has experienced, certainly not since Vietnam.
Yeah, the levels of loss, I think, are very fascinating because, there's a huge overlap, I feel, between being able to understand percentages and per capita, shall we say. And it's like, if you can't understand per capita, you don't understand.
Now that's a trope, Mandrill. Steady on.
Yeah.
Sorry, go on. I didn't mean to interrupt. I was just a joke.
No, that was my point. If you just because you lost, 10% of your force, you lost, or if you lost more men than the enemy, but they lost a higher force percentage, who's actually coming off the better out of that engagement? And yeah, this is what people don't understand about attritional warfare. So, like, they think, oh, well, Russia lost this many and Ukraine only lost this many. So it's literally the per capita argument all over again.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I was looking for this article. Defense Politics Asia wrote a couple of weeks ago, where they did a really interesting estimation using Grok to try and estimate the dead and wounded and captured on either side. It was a really good article. Defense Politics Asia has basically been my go-to source for at least a year, because they just, I find they do the best all-around coverage. So this was weeks ago for for Ukraine throughout the entire war. The estimate was 1.8 million casualties, with 900,000 dead and 900,000 wounded and captured. And then
that's horrific to consider.
The Russian side, 700,000 total, 250,000 dead, 450,000 wounded and captured. And he did a sustainability estimate until sometime in 2026. So I don't know. It was I watched a video on the numbers he had come up with, and it seemed pretty. Yeah, that was way back in February. It seemed like a good methodology, at least,
They at least had all of the numbers accounted for. Their accounting of all the different various factors of rate of loss seemed very, very detailed. It's probably the most detailed estimate I think I've seen so far out of anybody.
Yeah, I mean, all we can really say is, looking at the armies relative to each other, it's clear that whatever the actual attrition rate is, it's now weakened the Ukrainian military to the point where the rabbit ears are possible, and we're going to see more and more of these rabbit ears. I mean, on a daily basis, it's 20 to 30 square kilometers a day now, and that's only going to increase. So the Ukrainians are getting close to the breaking point in terms of the attritional warfare phase, and once we really we're not in maneuver warfare yet. It's still attritional, but once maneuver really returns to the battlefield, that'll be a real turning point. Looking back on the war, the real turning points we can see are Avdiivka. That's probably the only recent one I can think of. Like, Avdiivka is really just when everything started going south for the Ukrainians.
Ugledar. I would say Ugledar fell pretty shortly after Avdiivka.
Yeah, Ugledar.
Huge linchpin.
And by extension, the thing that made those two things possible was the absolute blunting of the so-called summer offensive. Like the losses there were monumental for Ukraine, and then those two things took place relatively shortly after.
Yeah, those are the key moments, I think, looking back. I mean, key moments, obviously, the big green counteroffensive here, and then the pullback of Kherson, and then Bakhmut. We're going to remember the Battle of Bakhmut. We're going to remember the failed counteroffensive, fall of Avdiivka, fall of Ugladar, which is, definitely almost as significant.
And by extension from Avdiivka, the real prize was sort of the capture of what was that place? You just zoom into Okrutina, and basically what we've seen is it was the emergence of a single Okrutina salient, and then that itself has bloomed into sort of two salients from there on in. Oh, and also the capture of Velia Novoselivka, because those two things
I forgot about that.
have permitted like this double envelopment of the Pokrovsk, Minorad, double salient if you count Konstantinivka as well. These two things have sort of led from one another. Because Ocheretine, essentially there was reinforcements sent there, and then they were pushed back almost immediately. There was almost no fight for the city. And then what was that other place they captured shortly after? I think it was travel a little bit further westwards. Yeah, keep going. Is it Svetove or something like that? I can't remember. There was like a large city, just there you go, Seladove. There was almost no fight for Seladova, and that there is an extension of the Otorechno operation, really collapsed this part of the front, and was probably the first real indicator that, hang on a second, these lines are very porous, and Ukraine is actually faltering, and certainly not from like a valor bravery standpoint, but certainly from an operational integrity standpoint, and
it's crazy to think. Yeah, go ahead, Mitchell.
I'm just looking at the map here, and I'm like, think of how long ago we were talking about how the Russians were having trouble taking Karlivka and Kurakova. Like that seems like forever ago. That was gosh.
Yeah, it's really weird because I remember looking at this part of the front for a while, and the speed now is just incredible. I mean, like we said earlier, this is going to be interesting too because the Russians are moving fast here. And once they close up Donetsk, literally like within the week, that momentum's probably going to transfer into the Zaporozhye front. They might push through parts of the Dnipro as well. I mean, the key cities here are Uspenivka and Holy. These are the two logistics hubs that are important at the moment, which they're going to go for. The Russians have been pushing this way as well. In a couple of weeks, we may well see large parts of the Zaporozhye start to fall, especially if the Russians decide to go through the less fortified parts of the Dnipropetrovsk Oblast. It's it's been really interesting looking at this war in real time,
Yeah,
and just sort of getting these daily updates.
The thing I wanted to address is because I don't want to sort of pick on people in particular, but there's just a couple of commenters. I'm just sort of looking at the chats here. Is that and sorry, not picking on you specifically, Hadrian, but this sort of whole idea of the the pro-Russia standpoint, and I mean not that it's about necessarily being pro-Russia or not. I suppose for us and our ilk, it's a case of not liking to see what our political and ideological, superiors are doing on our behalf is, I suppose, more the point. However, what's been difficult is, in terms of making these predictions and what have you, is that being able to quantify the extent of Western help. Probably none of us actually thought, and I mean, that's on us, but none of us probably actually thought that the West would support this for this long to this degree. And that's what's made predictions hard. And then also there's the point of what was an unknown quantity was the quality and the the termination of the Ukrainian forces, basically to sort of fight on the behest of the State Department and of Whitehall, which is sort of something to take into account. But I mean, yes, the Ukrainians have accorded themselves, with enormous, valor and courage on the battlefield. But there's just so many variables here that we've just been unable, and especially people like us. In the end, we're just like a bunch of YouTubers and ex-users. We're not in privileged positions to be privy to sensitive information and intel and what have you. I mean, we're just trying to do our best with what resources we have, and to what degree each of us have had military experience or have read military or are historians or whatever. And it's kind of like not fair to cast those dispersions our way, because I mean there are other people who've peddled the actual the actual how can I call it, like the Kool-Aid from the regime side of things, that have just swallowed and repeated everything they've been told, whereby we've actually tried
Yeah, I
to
don't
make
really.
it's not fair to like have a dig at us, if you get my drift. I just want to make that point clear,
No,
because it's not been easy.
No, that's the most annoying thing about people who like ankle bite at you as you do these streams, because almost nobody is actually trying to tell the truth here. I mean, that's extremely rare. We're just talking about like map updates and news on these
Also,
things.
also, Hadrian, I and that's why I didn't like criticize you, because he said I'm not against you, Pertinax. I'm like, no, I never took it that way, and it's actually good. Like, we don't want an audience of simps. Like, we're not here to have our ego strokes. Like, these are sensible adult, conversations, and we're trying to obviously get to a rational conclusion. And I'm sure that these other my two buddies here will agree with that, because I mean that's what we're trying to do, is just ascertain the truth of this.
I mean, I've long since blocked all the NAFO shills in chat, and I don't think they seem to exist or show up anymore anyway. I guess they still exist, but I mean, at this point, it's obvious what's happening, right? I mean,
totally.
We've been saying it's over for a long time. But the Ukrainians just keep fighting, and the Russians are just so slow. But it's when was the last time the Ukrainians had a successful offensive?
Yeah,
Never.
Well, I was going to say a successful operation writ large. I mean, really, if we want to be super technical,
Kursk, but
I was going to say you just zoom in a bit, Charlie. See those two little blue spots there next to the red? That little counterattack in Sumy region is the most is basically like the one little bright spot they've had in the last 6 months, if you want to call it that. Their ability to stymie and to actually push back in this Sumy front has been it can be credited as a success, but that's about it for Ukraine. That's about the only bright spot they've had.
Yeah, it seems like Russia's not actually interested in really opening this front, which isn't really a huge surprise. I mean, like, what would it actually accomplish to pour resources into capturing a city you haven't even annexed? Obviously, the threat is open, though. I mean, the fact that this whole northern front now is more or less active, except for some parts between Belgorod and Suja, is drawing a lot more Ukrainian troops. But it's every single part of the front now we can look at significant Russian gains. This forest area, obviously all along the Seversky Donetsk River, all the way up the Oskol River. I mean, there's simply no part of the front where the momentum is not in the Russians' favor on a daily basis at this point.
The thing I will say as well is that, I mean, what the Russians historically have done, and I mean, this was to some degree apparent in Napoleon's War, which I know is very distant from this kind of modern warfare today, but just for the sake of allegory. And then also sort of World War II is an obvious example. And I cited this, I think, when Charlie, you and I did this couple of appearances with AEA to, cover the war writ large, to do occasional updates, on UO. And one of the things that I used to cite, and I still think it's relevant even now, is that, the Soviet conduct of operations following Kursk 43 is actually really telling. Is that obviously the Germans marshaled, their a strong reserve strength, like they're these sort of formations that they rebuilt and re-equipped to attack the Kursk salient, and almost succeeded but didn't. And then the Soviets pushed back in that same area where the Germans had had attempted to encounter the Soviets in strength, there at Kursk and around Prokhorovka, and push them right back even to and past Kiev, by the end of 43. And then the beginning of 44, where the Soviets attacked, well, they attacked up in the north. They attacked up in Estonia. They tried to take Narva and cross the I think it's the Narva River that runs through the town of Narva, and they suffered quite comprehensive losses and failed to dislodge the Germans, although did succeed in bleeding the Germans white. So what did the Germans do? They sent infantry reinforcements to the north, and then to the south they sent a lot of anti-tank and armored formations to, stem the tide in the Ukraine. And then that made Army Group Center vulnerable, and that's where, come the summer of 1944, the Soviets absolutely they demolished and almost destroyed Army Group Center. And so what is a standout, part of Russian warfare is this propensity for isolated probing attacks elsewhere, and then saving their sort of the hammer blow for the part of the front that ends up being vulnerable. And I'm not saying that's an exact comparison will happen in this conflict here, but I'm just saying that there is this propensity for the Russians to attack elsewhere aside from their main objective, and then hit the objective a bit of in a Schwerpunkt fashion, like as the focal point with the greater part of their strength. And whether it's seen in a big aero offensive or whether it's going to be more of these reconnaissance in force type things, I don't know. But it's always worth looking back and seeing what is the sort of operational philosophy of this fighting force. And I mean, we see that with the Russians as the martial and military successors of the Soviets.
Yeah, someone was asking about the Alaska summit. We did cover it earlier. I think the problem is anyone who tries to do Kremlinology gets embarrassed. Like anyone who's ever done that in all of history is pretty much just always wrong. So we don't really know. I mean, it doesn't seem like Trump is particularly interested in this war, but he is unable to give the Russians what they want, if that's what he wants to do. Who knows how much he cares about the 4 Oblast or not. I suspect, as I said before, just to recap, the Russians are probably being told, like, we'll get a settlement once you take the 4 Oblasts, but you're just going to have to take them yourself because we can't give them to you. And I think it's pretty much as simple as that. But I'll go ahead and reinforce my prediction here. So, as I've been saying in the group chat, I think the Russians are basically going to move up to here. They're probably not going to take Dobropilia. Maybe they will, but I don't think they need to. I think they could hold even just this area. And they're probably finally going to push north of Udachne just to be able to have a tighter grip on this highway. And I think they're going for an actual encirclement here. I'm calling it Stalingrad because, let's be honest, they could probably storm Pokrovsk and Leningrad right now and take it if they wanted to. Obviously, they'd have to fight for it, but I think everyone knows that the Russians could achieve this, right? Based on everything else they've done. They clearly don't want to do that, and I think it's because they want to pull off an actual encirclement by stressing this highway and then finally cutting it after they, just think about what could be achieved, right, if the Russians, take these areas that I'm circling, and I'll make them even like smaller. Well, I messed up that one, whatever. Look at the rabbit ears. I mean, if they could move this far in like a day, they could just very quickly just cut that encircle and complete the encirclement, right? And then in this 100 square kilometer box, tens of thousands of troops probably are now going to be POWs. I mean, that's
a major win.
Yeah.
I think what's worth saying is that if Russia either goes for a complete encirclement or at least that sort of Mongol style, 4/5 encirclement and leave like one highway of hope open, in order to shell it to smithereens. The thing that's worth saying is that a successful, that being a success as they're probably intending or would aim for, would hasten the ends of the war either by treaty capitulation or just by sheer degrees by which it will cripple Ukrainian military capabilities. So whether that's just a part of their calculus whereby the Russians are just like, well, we can't, although the Russians have time on their side, they don't want to be at this forever either. Like, ultimately, Russian society doesn't want to be forever at war. And others have mentioned this, and I think that just to touch on what Hadrian's been saying in the chat is that, contrary to how the Westerners frame this is something of a sort of fraternal East Slavic, bit of a brother war of sorts. And,
yeah, I mean it's kind of a civil war.
Yeah,
really.
and ultimately
That's how it started.
Correct, and I think there are large sections of, at the very least, Russian society who probably want to see this war hastened and are tired of the bloodshed. That's just my take on it. But I think that is an undeniable aspect of this, and I think it's important part of the Russian calculus too.
So, anyone got any predictions for when the war is going to end? I've been saying 2026. I'm going to stick with it.
Well, Mandrill, I know you got to go, so if you want to just pop in first.
I
I
should
have
wrap up.
no predictions. Yeah, I have no further predictions at this point. Who knows?
Fair enough.
Yeah, so far everything just takes way longer than we think, but I'm going to stick with 2026. Given the increased rate that the Russians are moving, I don't see how it goes to 2027. It's a lot of time. It's that's another 16 months of fighting.
Yeah,
but,
well, it's one of those things where I think with warfare, it's one of those things. It's a bit like there's that allegory about how nations or empires decline very slowly, and then all of a sudden and very quickly it ends up being quite sudden. I think the same is true in some ways of military capability, and I mean, again, our best, most recent example of this at this scale is sort of like the Second World War. Is that you sort of think by mid 43, even after the disasters of Stalingrad, to some extent the surrender of the Africa Corps, the Germans and the Axis still held pretty strong strategic positions across Europe and the various combat theaters. By 1944, but certainly prior to the summer offensives with Normandy and Bagration, not a lot had changed, but there had been some setbacks, but still the Axis held strong positions. And then within 6 months, by the end of 44 and rolling into 45, the Western Allies are approaching the Rhine, the Russians the Soviets are crossing the Vistula, and then within 6 months the war was over. Which is, a lot of change within 18 months to 2 years. I mean, obviously we're talking at a very different level of intensity of combat, a whole strategic warfare element, many countries pitted against each other in a full total war situation. So I appreciate that it's different, but I'm more just making the observation that, these things have a lot of inertia, and, things can change in a relatively short space of time, as we've seen. I mean, there are. I'm trying to think of who it was. Oh yeah, well, we were talking about kings and generals before, and how the video update they've done has missed the last fortnight of changes in the front, and they have been dramatic changes of the front line. If you get my point. So I mean, these things are happening in a relatively short space of time. And I know, Charlie, you're probably, as most of us are a bit sick of this subject. But if we actually to canvas it, I mean, we could probably do an update in 2 or 3 months' time, and there would have been a lot of change, probably as much or nearly as much as what we've done since the 1,000-day stream to now. That's how I think the war is going to go from here on in my opinion.
Oh yeah, in 2 or 3 months, Pokrovsk is going to be cooked, whether or not it's taken or just so ridiculously enveloped that the writing is just on the wall. It's I mean, one thing we haven't mentioned either is just how much the missile and drone campaigns the Russians have conducted over the last few months are just insane. In Petropavlivka and Pavlograd, they are just hammering the Ukrainian logistics. I haven't looked at the missile strikes lately, but I know in the last few months it's been huge, hundreds of missiles fired, on a weekly basis at Kiev, Pavlograd, Petropavlivka, every single logistics hub the Ukrainians have, they are just hammering them with missiles.
That's crazy, eh? Like just that
all,
sheer
all,
scale.
all of it's just adding up to the point. Yeah, it's hopefully it ends soon. I'm hoping for a breakthrough because it's like if this really does go past 2026, I mean, Ukraine is just finished as a people. How are they going to recover with that much death? You know, that
I
much
agree.
loss.
Yeah, I agree with your take or with your prediction about 2026. The only thing that is that you know enters the calculus in that regard is to what degree does the sort of Kiev regime, the Zelenskyites and if he's toppled, does something more extreme, like say, the Azov group take power, and do they just simply dig in? And the other thing which might determine the length of the war is that, say, for example, after this encounter battle for Pokrovsk and Minorad finishes, or even if they just, awake from their slumber and just, in a week or two's time, decide on a unilateral, like, mass withdrawal. The only thing that could prolong the war is if they actually come to their senses and really pull back the front line. And when I say pull back, I mean dozens and dozens, if not even 100 or hundreds of kilometers, and really shorten the front and stabilize along natural barriers, which I suppose at that point you're really going to save the Dnieper at this point. I think that's about the only thing that will feasibly change the war in terms of its length. But given the way the Ukrainian command and government has handled this, I very much doubt that will happen. But that's the only thing to probably take into mind. If things continue on their current course, and if we see, these disasters, I mean, we've hardly even touched on Kupiansk. I mean, we've mentioned it, but we haven't really talked about it at length. But, the only thing is, there's the Konstantinivka, the Kramatorsk, Slavyansk, conurbation. There's Kupiansk in the north, if these battles also turn badly for Ukraine, like in the end, they're just not going to have men on the front. Like they're just not going to have a cohesive front line at all. And if there's a general collapse, if that collapse happens sooner or later, they are the factors which will determine the length of this war, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think collapse is inevitable, and that's probably the only thing that's going to end the war is the collapse. The Russians are never going to tolerate any sort of unresolved conflict. They're probably just going to have to achieve total victory unless Trump can convince them to give up the 4 oblast. But I kind of suspect that they won't, or that the Pentagon won't let Trump do that, and or the Europeans won't let him do that, and it's just going to be another million bodies. I mean, I remember when we were looking at those leaks years ago, and we were looking at the death figures, and it was still in like the tens or hundreds of thousands. And now, I mean, we're talking like a million dead, maybe a million on both sides. And these are just, they're Slavs, so take that with what you will. But there are Christians still. Meanwhile,
and Europeans by extension.
It's down here. Can we? We're not allowed to look.
And I will just.
You're on the pro-Russian stream. You're not allowed to look at Turkey. Sorry.
Yeah, we can't. I'm not trying to look at Turkey. There's something below, but I guess we're.
But just to touch on Hadrian again, is that I do emphasize his point about it, being a bloodshed, between sort of at least kin peoples, and the fact that this is a tragedy for, if we could call Slavic civilization, I suppose in part, distinct from Western Europe, but a part of the European sphere. This is, a great calamity for them, as a civilization, as a folk, as a people. And I certainly have no, I take no glee or joy from seeing what's happened. I'm if anything, I'm kind of infuriated at the NAFOs who have been, less so now, but certainly early in the war, was sort of, teeming with, salivating at the prospect of, Putin and Russia being broken apart, and this is where we've ended up, all that enthusiasm and glee, and just to see casualty figures like this is just actually quite horrifying. And although in some ways it will be a pleasant surprise or pleasant thing to see the how can I put this, the vested interests take an L. it's still not a nice thing to see, broadly speaking. And if I was a Russian or a Ukrainian or an Eastern Slav of any kind, I would consider this probably one of the greatest tragedies of the modern era, like the Second World War notwithstanding.
Yeah, I just wanted to stop. I mean, the whole reason we started doing these streams, at least for my part, and why I haven't done one in a while, is there needed to be some sort of counter narrative out there against the war and pointing out what was going on. And, one of the reasons why I haven't really been doing the updates is because I feel like we've basically done our job. I mean, people have more. I think most people have kind of come to see the war for what it is. At least the sort of war hawks are pretty much beaten down by that point. By this point, the one of the best people covering the war is that Willie OAM guy who kind of started out as a Ukraine shill and actually came around to see what was going on. I don't really think that doing these streams at this point has any real impact or effect, I should say, on the overall narrative, right? Where when we started doing these streams, there were very, very, very few people calling it how it was, which is that Ukraine was going to lose this war. And we definitely estimated that it would happen sooner than it has, but that was the whole point, is that this is just completely pointless. It's going to lead to the same outcome, and now here we are, a million dead bodies later, and it's still going on. So we'll do another stream eventually, maybe after Rolf falls, but obviously I'll
well, I mean, what are we in now? We're in August. I mean, I was going to say we could probably sort of conjure up something sort of in the lead up to Christmas. I don't know, or like October, November, something. We'll know more by then, I would say.
But I guess I'll do some shilling now. So obviously the place to watch my streams is actually the Old Glory Club YouTube channel. That's what I'm actually doing. We're now doing an incredible amount of work. Me and Ryan Turnipseed. If you're familiar with the old cigar streams we used to do with Academic Agent, that's basically what these are. We're reading a book every week. Sometimes we're doing a two-parter, as we did with Albion Seed. This is actually a playlist of all of our episodes right now. Our 6th one is going to come out this Monday, and we're basically reading books, answering the question, what is an American? And we're learning much more about our own heritage. A lot of this real American history has been neglected over the last several years. So we're deep diving into it. Like I said, we're reading an entire book every week. It's a difficult pace to keep up. I am extremely busy with this now, but yeah, basically this is pretty much my home now. I'm doing American Spirits every single week, new book every single week with Ryan. We have Semi-Agog on for one of them, and we'll have some other friends on. The Prudentialist is joining us next week, but this is a really important series to watch. There is nothing more important for Americans to watch right now than this stream series, because this is telling you your own history. It's really diving into the books, and we're gonna be doing this for years, hopefully. So a few years from now, we'll be a couple hundred episodes deep, and we will have read a lot of books. So next one's going to be on the frontier in American history, a book published by Frederick Jackson Turner in the year 1920. We are focusing a lot on older books, especially on books that have covered the 17th and 18th century to really get into our roots. Anyway, look up that if you've been looking for content.
Just to buttress, Charlie, just the importance you place on reading and learning about history. I mean, not to sort of shield for myself, but for those who don't know, I obviously am a co-host with our friend Apostolic Majesty, a wonderful and well-read Englishman, and we have many series and streams about various topics of history. And I just want to say that, not for the point of shilling necessarily, but there's a quote from Cicero that I absolutely adore, and he says that to know of nothing of what happened before you were born is to remain forever a child. And sadly, we live in an age and an era where sort of history is seldom spoken about honestly, and a lot of the history of our respective nations is sort of either completely unknown or deeply concealed, or when it's told from a perspective of intentional sort of ideological malice. And I think it's worth saying that what the boys are doing there at Old Glory Club is indispensable if you are an American or have an interest in American history. And I, as a shall I say this, a fellow Anglospheric, a man of the Anglosphere, and raised in a country that's not too dissimilar to America, but I mean, obviously Australians and Americans are different in many ways, but suffer from many of the same sort of ideological pitfalls of modernity. I would only encourage each of you to check that out if you haven't already. I mean, I know I'm sort of shilling to your own audience, Charlie, but really knowing one's history and the study of history and delving into things that, and I mean, I'm someone who, like, I literally need to buy a new bookshelf because they don't fit in my present bookshelf. Is that, I'm even always learning new things, and I even learn things watching you guys, and I can't but emphasize the importance of it, particularly for people like us to delve into that. So if you have friends who are interested in history, if you have family members interested in history, share this stuff, promote it, send video links and whatever, do it, because what Charlie and the guys are doing is absolutely indispensable. So I just want to say that.
Cool, thanks. And I think Australians are kind of the most similar people to Americans in the Anglosphere, if not the world. We have very similar histories, both Albion seed and being a frontier people. There's a lot 100%. In common there that others don't have. Canadians have some of that maybe, but they're our eternal enemies, so we can't compliment them. But
well, Australians never burnt down the White House. We didn't
they didn't do that. That was the British.
1812. So yeah,
the British did that.
Yeah,
but Mandrill, you want to show anything?
Yeah, I have, of course, articles that I write on Substack. I've got a couple in the works. I just released one today, actually, on the Old Glory Club's Substack, discussing the recent Twitter foibles of one Bronze Age pervert. It is behind the paywall, so you'll have to show your $5 dues to the Old Glory Club, but it's greatly appreciated. It goes to a great cause. I have my own YouTube channel and all of that stuff, which I recently broke 2,000 Twitter followers. It has been like at least a year since I got to 1,900, and it's been that long for me to break 2K. So I've done it, and now I have to do a stream on it, the obligatory AMA stream. So look for that to come out sometime over the next week.
Bravo, Mandrill.
Cool. Yeah, I forgot to read this, actually, so I will read it right now. I don't read everything on the blog just because I'm pretty much maxed out running the Old Glory Club at this point. Obviously, there's a lot of us running it, but doing the American Spirit stream especially, it's, I am maxed out. I cannot possibly be doing any more work than I am doing. But it's going to be worth it. So, yeah, definitely tune into American Spirits, tune into... or subscribe to our Substack. I mean, there's been a lot of good content over there over the years. It's a massive catalog of really good stuff. A lot of it evergreen as well. So, yeah. I guess we'll go ahead and end it.
Thank you, Charlie. Thank you, Mandrill. Lovely to catch up with you boys again.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. Good night, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. And see you next time we do this.
Cheers, guys. God bless.